Okay, welcome everyone to the 2022 Michigan DEC, or Michigan Division for Early Childhood Professional Learning Series. We're really excited to have you here tonight. My name is Nancy Serber-Goins, and I am the President-elect for Michigan DEC, and I'm your host for this evening. And today's session is our first virtual session in our series, and this series is made possible by a sponsorship through the Michigan Department of Education, Office of Great Start, Early Childhood Development, and Families Education Department. And so before we get started, I invite you to be part of this space. You can go ahead and unmute when you have something to share. If you want to have your cameras on, totally okay. Tunette wants to encourage as much collaboration and communication and co-creation within this space as possible. So I'd like to introduce to you our presenter this evening. Dr. Tunette Powell is an activist mama who has dedicated her life to disrupting the status quo while also honoring the freedom dreams of those who have come before us, our ancestors who believed that education could be and should be a passport. She is an instructor at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she teaches about critical race theory and educational policy. And she's also the director of equity, inclusion, and communities at Myland Schools. I hope I pronounced that right. If I didn't, I'm sure she will correct me. So this presentation, Dr. Powell asserts that solidarity between educators and families is essential to dismantling the status quo, especially for families of color and educators serving students of color. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Tunette. Welcome. We're so excited you're here with us.
Yes, thank you for having me. I first just want to start off with, I'm fine with whatever the flow you all want for this. As far as if you're a participant, if you want to have your video off, have it off. Sometimes you might be multi-managing over there. I was on a session the other night and I was cooking dinner at the same time. Like, I get it, right? And so I'll be super flexible. If you can share your screen, please do. We'll make use of being able to unmute and also be able to be active in the chat. But again, I really do believe that all of these sort of presentations, while I've come prepared with some slides that is very co-constructed. So as something stands out to you, feel free to just chime in. Let's stop, let's go there, because you can't have a presentation like Power to the People and it's only about one of the people here, right? And so it's about us. As you heard in my introduction, I play both role of parent and provider, right, in my daily work. And so it is in that, role as being both parent and provider that I've often thought about what it means to be a part of a system, to be impacted by a system, and what it looks like to have change within a system. So I'm thankful to be here. How I always try to kick things off, as many, many women have done before me, is I like to start off with some ancestral wisdom. This is from Audre Lorde. Without community, there is no liberation. And I use those particular words today because I believe that if you're on the call today, then you must care, right, about this work. You must want better, wherever you find yourself throughout the state of Michigan. And that reminder that sometimes we can do this work for a long time and we can feel like we might not be getting somewhere. But the only way to get there is for us to think about community, right? That doesn't mean just being together. Community actually has a feel to it, has a flow to it, and we'll talk more about that. But the way to get there is the collective. And so that's really what today's conversation is about. I always like to start off because as we begin to think about who we are, how we connect, how we build together, I always like to be reminded of this quote from Derek Bell. In many ways, we are our relationships, right? In many ways, we are our relationships. And so this image here, that's me on the left. That's one of my brothers. I have three. That's one on the right. And in the middle, that's my father. Now, you can use the chat or you can unmute. Where are we in this picture? Feel free to unmute or use the chat. I'm going to do my best to manage the chat while I have this screen up. So feel free.
The concrete blocks remind me of outside of school, maybe.
Okay, yep. All right, so outside of a school, anybody else want to guess? Okay, Holly said in a church basement. How about one more? My dad's job, Haley said. Okay, let's stop there. This is at a prison. My father was incarcerated for the first time when I was 4 years old. And I see Casey said, unfortunately, it looks like a jail. It is a jail. It's always interesting that whenever I show this image and ask people to think about where I'm at, most people always start with a school. And this very coincidental, right? Tidbit about whether, schools and prisons and the pipeline that we often talk about, but that is exactly where I'm at. And I was born in 1986, right? It was a very unusual year when you think about what we were with the war on drugs and the war on Black and Brown communities. And so for me, my father was addicted to drugs before I was born and struggled. And instead of receiving support and help, he was sent to prison, which is where he spent most of my young life. Nearly half of my life, he was in prison for drug addiction. I start there because it was my first introduction to a system, right? One where I was very much aware of. Now, of course, right? The moment that my mother decided to have me, there was systematic entry points. But this is the one I always start with because it was my first example of what systemic division looked like, because rather than support from my father, right, there was punishment from my father. And that had an impact on me, right? It had an impact on not only my family and home life, but also when I went to school every day. And I share that because similarly, all of these things that we have been through as a society all show up in the classroom, right? Whether it's mass incarceration, if we think about the failure of Reconstruction, if we think about slavery, if we think about Jim Crow, failed integration, which I like to refer to as desegregation because it was not truly integration. If we think about these things, right, police brutality, on and on, they all show up in the classroom. All of these very, very different systems, right, that still show up and shape the experience that we're having. And early on, those who are on the provider side and those who are on that familiar side get pitted against each other, right? And so if you think about some of these, it's no wonder that we're in this place in the first place. So what I always say to kind of ground us into this conversation is we need to start off with a few assumptions and beliefs, principles, epistemologies, right? Things that we truly, truly believe. And it's number one, in order for us to move forward in this work and to think about systemic division and how we're going to disrupt that division, is to number one, believe that parents are experts. Parents are experts. We have to start from that notion that parents are experts. Doesn't mean that they know every single thing, right? Providers are expert doesn't mean they know every single thing, but parents, every single person has some sort of expertise, whether it's about their own lived experience, their child's experience. It could be a certain subject matter, but parents are experts. The next one is that parents are their children's first teachers. And sometimes when we think about the relationship between those who are paid as educators and those who are, nurturing educators by way of that, being a parent role, we sometimes don't see them as teachers, right? But they're their children's first teachers. That before they step foot into a classroom, whether even if it was a early child education space, that their parents have been teaching them stuff very, very early on. And the last one, and this is the one that I say is powerful, which is why I want us to be in dialogue with each other today, is that solutions are in the community, right? And so if you think about where you are, and there's a number of us represented here today, but not all of us, right, from our communities represented today. You may say, I'm the only one on the call from my city or my town or my district, right, or my organization, wherever it may be. Well, as you continue to go back to your community, the solutions are in your community to whatever it is you're grappling with. And so today, right, is about us connecting. It's about us thinking about some of the things that can continue to spark and engage dialogues that we have to have in our communities. The solutions are there. It's not going to come from some outwardly place. It's going to come from us being in community with each other. And I say that because a lot of times when we think about how we work within systems, we're always kind of looking out, right? We need support from here, we need this from there. It's like, no, it is in the community. And so, how do we start there? So, I really like to look at three things, and we're gonna break these down into really 6 pieces. It's bigger than that, but I'm doing my best to kind of keep us organized in today. So, collaboration, reciprocity, and community, right? 3 similar words, 3 different words, all really this idea. And so I start with belonging, and we'll start here and we'll make our way. And again, I'll ask for folks, if you are in a position to unmute or a position to use the chat, you can. So belonging before engagement. Which one do you hear most often in schools? The word belonging or the word engagement? And you can type it in the chat. If it's belonging, write belonging. If it's engagement, write engagement. What do we hear a lot? Mostly. Belonging or engagement? I'm gonna pull up.
Engagement coming in.
Yeah, engagement, right? Engagement. That is one of the biggest things that you hear, is that engagement, 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 engagement. And I've had a lot of different roles in education, and I was formerly the director of a program called the Parent Empowerment Project. And it was at the focal point of it at UCLA. It was all around thinking about how we engage communities and families of color, how we really get parents engaged. And engagement has been a word that has taken over. And this is how I think about this. What does it mean to belong, right? Engagement, in the way that we've thought about it in a lot of schools, is almost like an outcome of belonging, right? When I want to be somewhere, I show up. When I feel like I'm a part of a community, I show up. And so let me ask you this, and again, if people want to unmute, if they want to put in the chat, I want you to just take off the hat, no matter if you're a parent today or a provider or both. Let's just take off that hat for a second and think about the last thing that somebody invited you to that you attended, a friend, right? Think about what that thing was. Anybody want to share the last thing that they were invited to that had nothing to do with school that you actually attended? You can raise your hand. You can write about what that thing is. All right. So Elaine said she was, and sorry, I don't have your pronouns, but Elaine said a dinner. Holly said a concert. Casey said a birthday party. Julie said lunch. All right. So question, if any of you are able to, and again, make usage of the chat. I'm a multitasker. I get it. What made you attend? And I guess another thing, what made you attend? How were you invited? Did someone email you? Did they call you? These same things. So the concert, the birthday party, the lunch. First of all, the dinner. Were you emailed? Were you texted? Were you called? Was it a Facebook invite? Did someone tell you about it? How were you invited? Through Facebook, a good friend, someone texted, a phone call, texted, okay? And what made you decide, all right, Mr. wanted to reconnect. So that's why why the rest of you, why did you decide to go? What made you go? You enjoyed spending time with that person. Okay. What made you go? Yep, coffee with a friend, hadn't seen them in a while. Right, right. So it sounds like, oh, right, I'm seeing a lot of love, a lot of missing. There's a relationship built. Now I want you to think about how many emails that you've received for events that you have not attended in the last week or two. Could also be Facebook invites. I get invited from a lot of things on Facebook. Tell me what those places, where were you invited to recently, right? Like I get a lot of emails for like professional development. I've gotten an email for a certain talk or lots of things. What were some of those things that you've gotten an email for or a Facebook invite and you did not attend? Something that you've recently got invited and you didn't attend. A work happy hour. Casey, that's a great example. What? And again, I don't want to put anybody on blast for the work happy hour because I actually got invited to a happy hour too for a leadership program that I'm in. And why didn't you go? Why didn't you go, Casey? If you're okay with
I
sharing.
can unmute for that. I didn't feel like driving the 30 minutes to see people that I didn't need to see. I have a coworker in this call, so I see Nancy chuckling over there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Look, I didn't want to call anybody out. This
No,
is a
that's
safe
okay.
space. But Casey, that's a really good point. So I also got invited to a happy hour through a leadership program that I was in, and I didn't feel like driving either. Right. So I get it. I get it. No one, Casey's not in trouble, y'all. This is it's an honest, real space. I see Lane saying a professional learning event get overloaded with these, right? And driving is a huge commitment. I'm out in LA where I feel like to drive anywhere just takes so much energy. But I want you all to stop right there and think for a second that when we had these relationships that we have formed, right, where I could hear so much belonging, no one said, anything about driving. It really wasn't about, it was like, I missed them. I hadn't seen them. I wanted, right? I love, right? It was very much. But then when we thought about some of the things that we didn't attend, we thought about driving, right? We thought about some of the logistics. We thought, I'm already overloaded, right? I have other things. We were quicker to kind of think about, right? You were like, I didn't want to drive there to see people I didn't need to see, right? Didn't seem like a real thing that I needed to do. The same thing can be true in schools, right? Is that somehow we've tricked ourselves into thinking that if we simply send an email, that people ought to just show up. They ought to just be engaged, right? They ought to come to the work happy hour, right? Or school, right? Our school thing. They ought to just come to that parent meeting. They ought to just come to this thing because they just will, right? Because we sent an email out, because their child attends here. But I can't tell you how many times I'm a mother of three. I have a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten from my kid's school where I'm like, I don't know if I really need to be there, right? I don't know if I need to spend my time doing that to see people that I feel like I don't really need to see, right? To play off a little bit of Casey's words, that's the reality, right? Is that sometimes I feel that way. But I know that there are instances where that can be shifted, where that can be changed, right? Sometimes we're busy. But I know that when we really do think about belonging first, that there can be moments where we kind of felt like, I don't know if I want to make that drive, that we did. Because now I'll ask you this. Think about a time when you were invited somewhere by someone that you love dearly, and maybe you didn't feel like going at first, or you would not have gone if they had not invited you. What was that place? Tell me about that. A time where if it hadn't been such and such who invited me, I probably would not have gone. Think about a time with that. Where is that time? Might not have gone if I wasn't invited by such and such. And think about who such and such is. You can put that in the chat. Or unmute. I would not have gone to a certain event if it had not been for such and such. And I'll give you an example that's really fresh on my mind. So over the past 2 months, I kind of had started saying no to a lot of things. I was at a moment where I really just needed to rest, right? I'm like, okay, I've been doing too much. I've been going too much. And I wasn't feeling as peoply as most people think that I always feel, right? I just need kind of a break. But I had a friend who was turning 40, and I decided that I was going to go back to Omaha, Nebraska for their 40th birthday. I lived there for about 6 years. And I remember thinking to myself, no one else besides my friend Dominique could have gotten me on a plane to go people for a 40th birthday party that had 3 nights of events or 3 days of events. No one else but my friend Dominique could have done that. Right? And we all have those moments where it's like, if it wasn't for whoever that is, how are we being that for someone else? Right? In our relationships. How are we doing that together? That's the piece that we need to think about building community, is that engagement is about belonging. Because I knew that even though I didn't feel like, peopling, I would, like, just by the mere presence of being in Dominique's presence, I knew I would feel that sense of belonging. And I'm sure everybody else who showed up had that similar thing. And so how do we show up for people? And what makes people want to show up for us? We think about these relationships all the time, in our friendships, in our family, right? And some of these other outside of work and outside of some of these schooling relationships. But it's so powerful us to think about that in the work of education. That we need to have that same intentionality where the robocalls won't work, right? The mass emails, without the relationship, it's going to be hard to engage me. And so one of the things we need to do, one of the things that we really need to examine and impact, is if the work that we're doing is more about engagement or is it more about belonging? Because I believe that if we think about belonging, people are going to be engaged. That's just going to be an outcome. The other thing I ask us to think about is pace and power, right? And pace and power, it brings about collaboration, it brings about reciprocity, helps us think about community. It's hard to have a conversation about systemic division when we don't think about power. And the thing is that in these educational spaces, the people who probably have the least power are both parents and providers. But a lot of times they get pitted against each other. And it comes with the idea, right, depending on what kind of community you're in, you may think, oh, parents have power and we have none. Or you might think, right, the school side, the providers have all the power and the parents have none. And so to ask ourselves this question of whose pace are we moving at becomes important. Whose pace are we moving at? Are we moving at the pace of our district school boards? Are we moving at the pace of the school's director? Are we moving at the pace because we have this federal funding? What pace are we moving at? And then to begin to examine that. Whose pace are we moving at? Are we moving at the pace of a few parents and we're not thinking about some of these other parents? It's incredibly important. It's going to fold into my next piece around tradition, because I think it's going to be important. As we talk about pace and power, I'm going to come back to that. But this next piece about examining traditions and standard protocols becomes incredibly important when we think about collaboration and community and reciprocity. Because a lot of times we'll say, well, that's just the way we've always done it, right? And that is one of the biggest things that maintains the status quo. And when we talk about disrupting systemic division, it's rooted in our status quo that will say, well, we've always had these meetings at a certain time. And I'll give you a real example. So when it came to this presentation, originally it was just going to be one day during a daytime. And that was going to be the way it was. You and I weren't going to have this moment. And I said to the organizers, I said, is it possible that we could do an evening time? And it's not evening for me yet on the West Coast, but an evening time. And then also that daytime part, that morning talk that we want, or that lunch talk that we want. And of course, the organizer was completely on board, but I'm always thinking about how can we maximize what we're doing, right? That if we know that everybody doesn't have that lunch hour, everybody doesn't have that morning time, but what we can we try to reach as many people as possible and to offer something in the evening for those who need it, something in the morning, or perhaps lunch hour if they need it. How do we begin to kind of push against it, even if it's not what we normally do? I'll give you another example that's really, really important. So right at the start of the pandemic, I had an organization reach out to me and they said, we serve young people whose families don't have a place to live. And we really want to think about how we make sure that we're giving them everything that they need in the pandemic. And they said, so we want to come to you. And at this time I was at UCLA and I told you I was over the Parent Empowerment Project. And I said, well, the best way is just to ask them. They were like, okay, well, how do we go about this? And so we emailed out these families that were on their list. They were all houseless and all going through a variety of other crises, as you can imagine, in a pandemic. And I never forget, I said, but if we ask them to meet with us, to share what they're going through, we need to offer them every type of chance to do so. So when we sent out times to meet, it was as early as 6 a.m. and as late as 10 p.m. that they could meet with us. And every session that we did with those families was either at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. Now, that's not tradition, right? I mean, I've been involved with schools, for a while now, and most parent meetings were either during a school day, they were right after school on occasion, right? But I have never seen a school, right, say we're going to meet with a parent at 8 or 9 p.m. It's an inconvenience, right? For the provider side, it was incredibly convenient for these families. They stayed on the call with us. We were doing these through Zoom till about 10 p.m. Now that took a lot of sacrifice on my part, right? Because I had a family event, right? Julie, I love it, right? Well, there are families, right, working different shifts. Same thing. Well, we need some of these meetings where it's like, that's the reality. But if we have these moments where we're thinking, they don't care, they weren't at that meeting, right? Those are the ways that sometimes we say these things that add into the division. And so again, examining our traditions. What time are we meeting? Why do we always do, the parent-teacher conferences at the certain time that we do them? Whatever it is, just examining that and going back to that question on whose pace are we moving at? And I would dare add to that to think about, not only whose pace, but on whose terms, right? So it's like, how are we making some of these decisions? And I'll tell you that this takes work. And you may say, I'm tired already. But I'll tell you this, what I've realized in my practice is that when I've cared more about making sure that I'm thinking about the pacing, that I'm thinking about the terms, that I'm examining the things that I have said are normal or traditional or regularly what we do, and when I've shifted, it's actually made the work easier. Sometimes the work is harder, even if it's what we already know, but it's harder because it's what we already know, but it's not ingrained in community. When things are built on collaboration and reciprocity and community, it is easier. It doesn't start off that way because we got to retrain ourselves to ask different questions. But then it does become easier because you can see the impact. It doesn't feel like you're on this wheel, right? Just simply turning. You can feel the shift. And this work of collaboration and reciprocity and community is all about a cultural shift, right? It's not simply, here's a program that you can throw in tomorrow, which is what we typically want. What can I do tomorrow? It's like, we got to stop and get to know each other. We got to stop and look at all of the things that we've been doing that have not been serving the people that we care about, the children that we care about. And as we begin to ask those questions and do those things and examine the systems that we've put in place, we have to center the truth. And I say that because few things can be done well without the truth. That we have wherever we are. What's the story of this place? What's the story of this space? What's the story of this place and what's the story of this space? And I say that as something that is incredibly important. We have to center our truth in these spaces. And I'll give you different examples of what that looks like and ways that you can think about what that looks like. So I started out talking a little bit about, my father being in prison most of my life. I would say about half of my life. I talked about those struggles, but in addition to that, right, as a parent, I've gone also through my own struggles. And so I'll share something and then I'll unpack it, all right, because I think it'll be helpful. Old folks say trouble don't last always, but I can't shake it. What they do now, every time the phone rings, I can't fake it. Can still see the hurt in my grandmama's eyes. You just like your daddy, girl. You ain't gonna make it. We all walking around with the trouble. It's a cycle, feels like we ain't gonna break it. And my mama's crying out, Lord, I just can't take it. School said I was bad, so that became my new name. After so many suspensions, you're never the same. Watch the adults around me play the blame game. Laugh like you don't care to keep from going insane. No matter how far removed, I can still feel the pain. 20 years passed, but I can still see the stain. School did more damage to us than crack cocaine. Trauma so deep that it runs through my veins, but this ain't strange. This is as normal to Black as normal as Seattle sees rain. But y'all don't see us, so the trauma remains. This is me centering my truth. My truth that not only was my father incarcerated for half of my life, but when I went to school, I was suspended, I was expelled in early childhood education. I was probably suspended from every grade except 8th grade and 12th grade. A very similar story for my younger brother, who I showed in that picture early on. And so the relationship that I had to school was not a positive one, right? And so flash forward, right? Now I am a parent, and the year is 2014. And at that time I had a 3 and 4 year old, 2, 3 and 4 year old sons. And I have 3 sons now, but my oldest were 3 and 4. And I never forget, in 2014, I got called and said that my 4-year-old was going to be suspended from school. Very traumatic experience for me, especially having already had a negative relationship with school on my own growing up. And I never forget, thinking, how could this have happened? We tell ourselves, I think a lot of stories in our head will say, well, the reason why that child is acting like that is because her father was on drugs. She's in a single parent household now. They're in poverty, right? We'll say all of these different things to see the child as the problem and not the way that we think about behavior and the way we respond to behavior as a problem. And so in 2014, I was shocked because here I was, right? Living in Omaha, Nebraska at the time. My husband was in the Air Force. I was doing very well career-wise. My kids in a 2-parent home, living in a very safe community where the door was always unlocked. Just a very different life, and still having a very similar result. And 2014 was a unique year because it was also the same year that the Department of Education and Office for Civil Rights released data that showed the preschool suspension disparities. That despite, right at the time, Black students making up 18% of the preschool enrollment, that they were accounting for nearly half of all of the suspensions. And so the important thing, as I have continued to decide where I'm going to send my kids to school and some of these decisions, was what was the story of this place in this space? And that means people having an understanding of our story, right? How we have interacted with these spaces, but also what is the story of that place? That right now where you are, there's a family that has had a negative experience at that place. Could have been before your time, could have had nothing to do with you, right? And because I'm on the side of provider and both parent, like, we can't say, well, oh, that was, back then, I don't have anything to do with that, but it's like, no, there is a truth in everywhere that we are, and it is our duty to understand the story of this place and space. And that's where we start, is being able to recognize that educational institutions have been spaces of harm for certain group of people, for people in poverty, right? For people of color, right? For people sometimes in rural communities. Like, it goes on and on and on, that there are levels of what it has looked like to experience an educational institution. And it has not been good. We always, we talk about education as a very promising thing, right? The great equalizer. We talk about the hopes, and there is so much hope in education, right? It was a reason why, my ancestors, those who were formerly enslaved, did not want freedom without education for their children. There is also a reality that my ancestors as well saw how education was also this space of harm. If we think about some of the boarding schools, and we think about Native communities, right? If we think about, classrooms where you didn't have access to whatever you needed, there is a hope, but there is also a need for healing in schools all around this country. Michigan, no different, right? There is that hope, but only if we address the healing that is needed. And that takes us to accountability. That when we've centered our truth, we can begin to think about accountability. And to me, there can be no community without centering that truth and without rooting ourselves in accountability. The need for us to call each other in, to repair, right? And to make room for that healing. And I think the calling in is a hard thing. But if we go back to some of those relationships, this idea of belonging before engagement, it can be easier, right? Everybody talked about, listed people that got them to go to dinner or that they hung out with to have coffee, the people that they cared about. Those are probably people who can also call you in and say, hey, something you said, it didn't feel right, whatever it may be. Hey, I need you to show up, whatever it may be. If we can get to belonging, we can call each other in. And how do we become self-reflective? Where both as a parent and a provider, I've had to go to another person and say, you know what? That wasn't my best moment. I do that now as a married person. If you've, been in any intimate relationship, you've had to call yourself in and think about, okay, I was upset when I said that, right? Okay, I've kind of looked at that, right? Going back to some of these questions about whose pace we moving at, the way that I said, I've done my classroom for the last 15 years might not make sense right now, right? That there is that moment where we're going to have to do that. And because we care about collaboration, because we care about community, and because we care about reciprocity, we want to be that for each other. I want to see what's happening in the chat. Okay. So Julie said, I have been learning about restorative practices. Yeah. And you know what? That's the part where it can't just be a program that you implement, Julie. You're absolutely right. And I think that we have kind of programmed ourselves into thinking that programs will actually save us. And we put programs on top of foundations that have not really been created, right? And so if you think about how you build a house, if you have foundational problems, doesn't matter how beautiful that house is on the inside, right? Every program that you've established, it is not safe, right? It will not stand, right? Like it is not going to be durable with the weather conditions, whatever it may be. And so again, the culture shifting work says before the programs, not saying programs are not important, initiatives are not powerful, they are. But if we haven't built the foundation that we need, that is rooted in collaboration, reciprocity, and community, then these programs won't be sustainable. And these 6 things we're talking about here are about how do we create sustainable cultures in our communities, right? How do we create sustainable cultures? And so I think, yeah, there's tons of programs out. And that doesn't mean we don't need to learn it. We do, right? Restorative practices are powerful. I implement them daily. But I would never just go in and somewhere and say, here's a restorative practice, here's this PD that we need. It has to be, what are we doing to build relationships, to create a sense of belonging for everybody? And then along the way, our learning brings in these restorative practices that can help us, right? And so I know a lot more about, I should say, I would be able to understand a restorative practice more if I understood my context more, if I knew my community more, if I knew my teachers better, right? If I had a relationship better with my staff, right? So no matter what you're on, whether you are facing the community and so you work directly with the community, or if you oversee a staff, right, and you work directly with staff, like all of these principles are important for us. They're important for a community. And so it doesn't matter, we're gonna have to call ourselves in. And I'm someone that likes to sit in a state of reflection. That even as we go away from each other today, I'd like to reflect, right? And think about what were some of the things. That space of reflection is where accountability gets to creep in and where we can be better. And also, right, just thinking too, like, of the importance of our truth. And I say our truth because it's not just about us as individuals, it's about that also collectively. So even if you say, I'm great at what I do, I have great relationships, if that's not the case for the entire, right, place that you're in, and very rarely will it be a full case, how do you then work and build bridges, right, between what's happening in another classroom or another, right, another sector of your organization? How do you create those opportunities for bridges? So if you're like, I got it, I do the relationship work, who are you extending that to, right? How do we continue to think about our own story, but also our collective story. If you say in my city we got it down, how do we reach across the rest of the state? Right? And then from there, how do we reach across our neighboring states? Start thinking about our region, right? And so collaboration, reciprocity, and community, it starts with where we are, but we ought to want to be able to spread our wings out, right? Be able to pull our hands out and someone else is connected to us. And then eventually, right, there is no room for division to exist. The last one is grace. Grace is really, really important. It's really, really important to me because we can't ask for what we aren't willing to give. And we're all going to need grace in this work. That I don't care how long you've been in this business. I don't care how many kids you've brought through, a preschool through 12 education and even beyond. We're all going to need grace. It's not going to always be our best moment. We're not going to always feel well. Who knew several years ago that we'd be going through a pandemic together, that we'd be navigating in this way, right? I mean, the last 2 years have been especially difficult for me. I feel like I've been operating at one of my lowest capacities. And doesn't mean that I haven't done some good work, but I've needed grace. And in return, I've needed to give someone else grace. And so again, we can't ask for what we aren't willing to give. Every time that a parent doesn't show up, I want us to remember the time that we didn't show up, right? Because there is a time in our lives where we didn't. Where we said I was too tired. I didn't feel like driving. I didn't feel like getting on another Zoom meeting, right? Like there could be some of you like, I'm keeping my camera off just because my eyes need a break, right? No matter what it is, that even, right, we will sometimes hold ourselves to we'll hold others to a measure that we won't hold ourselves to, which is why I'm never going to say, everybody have your screen on. It's like, no, sometimes it just doesn't make sense. That just because my screen isn't on doesn't mean I'm not engaged, right? And so again, if we can think about the grace that we sometimes need and give that to others, oh, that parent came in with an attitude this time. Who knows what happened right before? You know, as we think about what we're doing with students, right? And it's like, I don't know. We never know what folks are going through. You know, I was at one of my kids' school recently, and I was waiting in line to sign them in. They were running late. We were running late that day. And I always need grace. Sometimes we're running a little late because you make decisions as parents. You say to yourselves, okay, I didn't get to grocery shop the way I wanted to, so I didn't have the breakfast that my kids love, but a good start in the morning for my kids is going to be a great day at school. So I decided to get them something to eat, knowing that we would be a little late. So we get there a little late. We have this moment where, of course, everybody wants you exactly on time, you know, and it's seen as, they're always late, or it's like, no, but these are decisions that we make. So I needed grace in that day because I wanted to make sure that my kids had something good to eat so that they would have a better day at school. But not only did I need grace, I was in front of a parent who I could tell needed some grace, right? So as you think about me, I'm trying to hurry up. I'm like, oh my gosh, this parent is kind of taking her time. And then I hear right in front of me that this parent is talking about an unfortunate situation where their kid had missed a lot of school because of a custody battle. And you think to yourself, you wanted to rush that parent, and that parent needs grace, right? That as you're late, so you want everybody else to move out of your way so you can try to catch up, but they're also going through something. Our colleagues are going through something, right? Our families are going through something. We may be going through something. How do we give that grace? How do we give that grace? So this is a concept that I think is incredibly powerful for me. It's very simple. Love Toni Morrison. Love, yes, Julie, I'll go back there. Love much of the work that she dedicated her life to. And the function of freedom is to free someone else. I say that because we may be in spaces where we feel that we are doing a great job, that we love the way that we're moving, the things that we're doing, right? We found what that freedom looks like for us. But the inside job is so that we can do more things on the outside. right? So all of this work is about Ubuntu, which is what happens to you happens to me. That is the function of this work, is how do we do this moment of working with ourselves, right? Doing what we need to do, help someone else. That means we have to have a lot of grace. We have to recruit ourselves from judgment that we sometimes want to have. And to the question that was asked about more about calling in is an interesting concept for me because on one end, I've watched a lot of people use it as a way, and I'll just be very honest with you, as to say, well, you need to find a nice way to tell me about myself. And, you know, and people have, you know, there's kind of this calling out versus calling in. And I will say that when I use calling in, it simply means, and, you know, there's going to be levels to that. If you're in a moment that is very heated, someone might call you in a way that doesn't feel good, right? If we have time, I might call you in politely and say, hey, you know, I want us to sit down and look at some of the practices that we have in place, because I noticed that, you know, we've been sending a lot of kids home for some similar behaviors, right? That's also a form of calling someone in. Might not be making it just about them. What I always try to do, and sometimes it is about them. In my work, right, I said I'm the director of equity, inclusion, and community. I like to look first at not who is the problem, but what is the problem, right? So I frame all of my calling in around what is the problem. And so if we're noticing, if we think about discipline for an example, if we're noticing that there are, you know, that we're sending young kids home, if kids are any age, the problem here, let's look at that. Let's think about some of the strategies that we have in place. What are we not doing? If we notice that we have lower number of parents interacting in some of the events we're hosting, instead of saying, well, you know, we can never get such and such to show up, well, we're saying that they're the problem. But if we say, hey, let's see if this event is effective, right? Let's try to make sure that we're figuring out what do people want to come to, and also realizing that there are just some things that people are not going to show up as. I'm not really the happy hour person like Casey, right? I'm not the happy hour person. Maybe with a friend, maybe with a close family member, but the work happy hours are not my favorite. It's not saying I don't love people that I work with. I do. It's just not really my thing. And there could be a parent that feels that same way. That yes, if there is that awards program for my child, I'm gonna show up. But I might not want to go to that other event that the school puts on every year. It might not be my thing. And so how do we have those moments where we make it less about people and more about the problem? So that's number one, what I would say with calling in, is that we start off with this idea of what is the problem, not who is the problem. Now, in some cases, people can be part of the problem, right? And so what does that look like to actually have to call someone in when you feel like they are a part of the problem? I had a situation recently, and I try to be transparent with you all and give you real examples, because I was working with a school, and I don't give names. I just say I was working with a school. I work with a lot of schools around the country. I was working with a school in Los Angeles, and they were really thinking about recruitment and retention of faculty and staff of color. And they were doing a pretty good job of bringing faculty and staff of color in, but not a good job of keeping them. And when I started to kind of unpack the data, it looked like they were losing faculty and staff of color in one part of the school, right? And the more and more I unpacked, it seemed like there was something about someone in a leadership role in this certain part of the school that was creating this problem. And I had to sit them down and have a real critical conversation. That in all of my, conversations that I've been having with faculty and staff of color, it's been cited, and this is a very hard conversation, but a very necessary one, that there is something that you're doing that appears to be intentional, that appears to be unintentional, that has more to do with maybe a difference in culture, right? How, what feels comfortable to some and doesn't feel comfortable to others, that could be very gendered, right? Like pulling some of these things out and then being able to give very real, concrete examples. So here's an example of something that was said that I know was intentionally rooted in love, but did not land that way, right? But again, when you're going to call someone in, when it's based on a lot of not just who they are, but how they interact, I think it's really, really important to have really concrete examples. Because the whole point is, and this is what I don't want you to miss, this is what I think is incredibly important, is this is not about, we get to a point and we get to a place where there's no conflict. That's not what we're saying. So it's not, parents and providers never having conflict, colleagues never having conflict, never having anything to resolve, right? It gets to a place of, how do we do that in ways where we're not creating division, right? So I need to give you this feedback. I need to call you in, but it's so we can continue to think about this work together, right? Same way as if we're in a parent teacher conference, and I don't know, where everybody is, and we'll have a few minutes where I want to be able to have questions, but thinking about the spheres that you're in, if you have a child that is not doing well in math, did not mean that you didn't like the child anymore, right? And you thought the child was a problem. No, I want to figure out strategies to support the child, same way that we have to do with adults, right? Is that we want to be able to give this feedback, be able to call in some of the areas where there needs to be improvement, but we're collectively working to think about how we get there. And so I want us to realize that the presence of conflict does not mean division. Division comes from us feeling that it's more you versus me, right? It's you versus me. No, it's us against the status quo. Us against the status quo, right? I don't think there's anybody around that doesn't believe that we can be better, right? As a nation in education, we can. But do you think I'm the problem, or do I think you're the problem? That's where the division lies, right? And so how do we get out of that and continue to elevate ourselves in a way where we can be focused on these things, on belonging, on thinking about our pace, thinking about how we share and concede power, examining our traditions, centering our truth, being accountable to each other. Sometimes we need to call ourselves in. I had a moment once at a place that I was working at where it was just a high tense situation. And I remember that I said something about someone and they weren't in the room. I was very upset. It was just a moment for me. And I said, you know what? I'm gonna go to that person and let them know you weren't in the room, but I said this. And then publicly back in that same room that I said it, I acknowledged that I said this in that room and that was not my best moment. Hard to do. Hard to do. It's the work that I've dedicated myself to. This work of collaboration, reciprocity, and community it's messy work, right? It's messy work that we've put it here into these little categories and made it look nice on this slide, but it is messy work. And so if we can call ourselves in, it gets a lot easier. Because even as I said that to that person, that I want to acknowledge that I did that I said that, but also realizing that my public apology and both my private apology is not going to fix this. It's going to create room for repair, and that has to happen over time, right? We're not going to fix things overnight. Even when we understand the truth and we start with the truth, it's going to take time. Like any other relationship, it's going to take time. If I ask you to think about some of the relationships in your life where you've actually been able to repair, for adults, it takes a lot more time. For kids, they could be fighting one minute and friends the next, right? We're not like that. I'd like to see us get closer to the childlike, but we're not there, right? We've had a, past that informs a lot of stuff that we go through. So again, it's going to take a little bit more time for us, but I want us to think about how we do that work. And so I wanted to leave time. I think we have about 5 minutes, if I'm right on it. I wanted to leave time for us to be able to just be in conversation. And it's not a lot of time. It's not as much time as I would have liked us to have, but I'm going to stop sharing screen here so that we can just have a moment for us to just be in community together. I know there are a few of us who are sharing our screens. There are a few of us who've been listening in, and no obligation, but I want to allow us to ask questions. If you have, an example or situation, where there's something you're thinking through or want to unpack, I want to start off by saying that I don't consider myself as like a lone expert in the room. So if there is a question that I feel like makes sense to open up. I definitely want to do that.
Tunette, if I may, thank you for understanding for the screen being off. I am multitasking, but I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate what it is that you have shared today. And it has always been my hope and prayer that here in LA, people from the district, the higher ups, the ones that are at school, would embrace your characteristics, would embrace your thought process, and would embrace what you shared today. Because I think if they did that, there's so much that we could resolve in terms of building back relationships, because that's the problem. They
Yep.
say it's money, they say it's this, they need more of that. But with having all of that, at the end of the day, the issue is the building of relationships. And that should be precedent. That should be before an application is filed for a child to be registered in school. So I just want to thank you. And I hope that everyone here, could take this back to their districts. And it's just my hope that you could continue delivering this message because it's much needed. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Monique. And I will say, like, you're absolutely right. I mean, we talk about money a lot in schools, and of course, there is funding. There's never enough, right? We need our states to better fund. But the truth is, for me, who experienced a lot of poverty when I was growing up, like you can see how, as they used to say, my mama made a dollar out of 15 cents, right? Like you can see that where that has been made where you can have a little bit and still do a lot. So it's not to say that we don't need more funding, but again, if you're throwing money on a situation that's not good, it's not going to save it. I was working with a school that was the most funded school I had ever seen. They had enough to hire everybody that they needed. They were trying to get rid of money before the funding ran out. I mean, before the funding, before the grant deadlines. But it was a mess, right? It was a mess. I just watched us just waste money. And so we do see that. And like I said, that's why it's not just about a program. It has to be about a culture shift. That's the only way that we can do this work, so that when the money does come to us and the money is increased and we do have those funds, we are doing that in collaboration, right? And in community. And so I appreciate everything you said, Monique. Any other questions or thoughts or anything for the good of the group? I see Lane in the chat. People will fund things that they have formed a positive relationship with and recognize the importance of. Yeah, like, and I'll tell you, I love stories. So I'll tell you this very brief story. But it's interesting because I never forget that I was working. So I used to be a journalist a long time ago. When I was 19, I started working at a newspaper and I worked there for 5 years. And I never forget, I was writing a story about folks who were experiencing homelessness. And it was a group that nobody else could get this story. I went down to where they were and I got this story. And I never forget the day that the story came out. A lot of the folks that were in that community were standing in front of the newspaper, and they had coffee for me, and they had purchased all these copies of the newspaper. And it was one of those things where they were like, we never buy the newspaper, but you saw us, right? You highlighted us, not saved us, you saw us. And I do think, to that point, that people will invest in something that they believe in, whether they have a lot or a little. And so I do think that becomes important, that we need to have a positive relationship with school. We need to have a positive, relationship with the place. And we have to be able to be mindful of the fact that not everybody has had a positive relationship with education, right? Not everybody has. I think about when I get calls from teachers, even when they're positive, there's a piece in me that remembers 2014, right? And so there is that trauma and that trigger that says, oh, even though my kids are doing well, you still have that. And so it's important for us to think about that. Any other thoughts? I like to be respectful. We're right at time. So I want to be respectful to what you all have going on, the time that you've allotted for this conversation. I did have my email at the end of that slide. I'll just put it in the chat here, and people can feel free to reach out if you want to. I always think if it's somebody on the call that you're like, oh, I need to connect with that person, put your information in the chat as well if you feel like you want to do that, because I really do believe that this, this work is not about me, right? It's not about one individual person. It's about a collective. And I really do, I want to thank, each of you for being in this space and on this call today. I hope that, I will also, I don't know if there's a way to make the slides available to you, but I'm happy to do so. I believe that I own nothing and everything is everybody. So whatever I can do to be helpful, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you very much, Tunette. Yes, a lot of people are saying thank you for the conversation in chat. And so if you want to share the slides with me, I can email them out to everyone that registered today, and then we'll see if we can't post them as well so people can access them. So thanks everyone for coming this evening. Those registered and those who are registered and would like continuing education hours sketches, please, we're going to drop the link in chat. Sorry, I kind of forgot where I was going with that. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is our first session in the series. Tomorrow, Tunette would do a very similar session from noon to 1. So if you have other people that you would like to hear message or be part of the conversation, or if you want to come back again, well, feel free to do so. It will be at the same link, and those that register for tomorrow will get a link in their email tomorrow morning. Next week, April 14th, please join us for our third session in our virtual series. This will be as we welcome Dr. Walter Gilliam to a session titled Inclusion Work is Equity Work, Facilitating Access and Participation for All. And that session is a partnership with Michigan Council for Exceptional Children and the Michigan Department of Education Office of Great Start. Our fourth session in the virtual series is our annual conference, which will be held on April 29th, which we welcome Dr. Gilliam back to do a deeper dive on his research. We have 12 breakout sessions on that particular day, as well as Walter giving us an update, sharing the impacts of the pandemic on families, children, and practitioners. And then our last session in this series is May 13th, which we will wrap it up with a closer look at the continuum of placement options for preschool special education. That will be done by our own Elaine Meyer, and from Oakland Schools. I will put in chat the Michigan DEC website so you can find all of these events, so you can take a look and register if you are interested. Thank you everyone for attending this evening. Have a wonderful evening.